Hi everyone, welcome to Chingford Historical Society's second talk in a series of talks that we've got online via Zoom since lockdown. We have two talks for you today. The first one is being done by Joanna Moncrieff. She's talking about Charles William Alcock, the forgotten father of English sport, and he has Chingford connections. The second talk we've got is by David Boote, and he's talking about Chingford Hall and Chingford Mill. Both talks are going to be around 20-25 minutes each, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions as well. Just a reminder though that if you want to follow us as a society, there's many ways you can do so. For example, if you wanted to contact us via social media, we have our own website, which is a brand new site, started last month. On that website, you can look at information about us, what we do. We also have on there the opportunity for you to join us as a member. You can do so. We're currently freezing any membership fees until January next year, so there's nothing to pay until next year now. And on there, of course, you can always message us. So if there's any questions you've got that you see tonight, or see today, should I say, on these two talks, you can message us and we'll get back to you as soon as we can. We've also got a Twitter account as well, where we regularly update you with any talks we've got coming up in the future, and of course any bits on history. We also have a Facebook page. You can go on there and look at information about us there as well. So in this time when we're having to distance ourselves, you can still keep in touch with Chingford Historical Society and our work with regards to local history. Just a reminder also that we do have another talk coming up. It's for Thursday the 16th of July. We haven't decided quite what it's going to be on at this moment, but in the next week or so we will come back to you and let you know what that will be. It's likely to be though about one of Chingford's most historic buildings, so we'll let you know about that. But less about me now. I'm going to hand you over to Joanna, who's going to start the first talk. Thanks, Joanna.
Okay, so I'm going to talk tonight about Charles William Alcock, who's known as the forgotten father of English sport. I wonder how many people attending this meeting actually know that he has a Chingford connection, or for that matter, have even heard of him. He was born on the 2nd of December 1842 in Norfolk Street, Sunderland, in an area known as Sunnyside. He was one of 9 children and had 8 of his own. His father was a successful ship owner, later a shipbroker, and in the mid-1850s moved the family south to Chingford. If you know about the history of Chingford, you'll know that the census for 1851 shows that the population at that time was only 963 people, so it was quite cut off. He lived at a place called Sunnyside, a house called Sunnyside, and those that live nearby will probably know this building, which is all that remains of Sunnyside, a former gate lodge at the junction of King's Head Hill and Woodbury Way. You'll spot that there is a blue Waltham Forest plaque on there. If I zoom into that, you'll see that there's no mention at all of Alcock living at Sunnyside, and it just refers to this gatekeeper's lodge being connected to a 10-bedroomed house, which is now where Woodbury Way is. In 1857, his father, also called Charles, bought 40 acres of meadowland, which included Park Hill Farm and extended down King's Head Hill. Ownership of the land was put into his wife's name. Now, this map from the National Library of Scotland, their collection of historic OS maps, shows, you can see the lodge here. I'm not sure you can see my pointer well enough. Sunnyside is on the map, and you've also got Park Hill and Park Hill Farm all shown on the map. And you can see where Mornington Road, all these roads around that are there today were not there then. This was surveyed in 1866. But there is some confusion I've found in my research of Sunnyside, because it would seem that there are two houses of the same name. About 5 years ago, I was contacted by a man called David Harrell, who used to live in Sunnyside, but he informed me that he didn't live in this Sunnyside, the one on the postcard, but he did live in this Sunnyside. Now, so this, it obviously makes research quite difficult. When I looked at the census for 1891, which I wasn't sure about if I was able to share it because of the copyright implications, so I've typed it, and you can see there are almost a whole page referring to Sunnyside, but 3 different buildings, or 4 if you include the lodge as well. So the top entry, Sunnyside, Arthur Alcock, who was one of Charles William's brothers, and also his sister Edith Marion, are living there in 1891. Both their parents had died by that point. And you've also got Mr. Vaughan living at another Sunnyside, and Anne Dunsford at a 3rd Sunnyside. I mean, this is a whole another avenue of research that I've started. And I mean, there is a bit of a clue in the sales particulars from 1893, because it refers to the Sunnyside with the 10 bedrooms, but it also refers to Park Hill Farm, 4 cottages in Low Street and 4 semi-detached villas. Obviously the building, the picture I've just shown you, wasn't semi-detached, but I think it implies that it was more of an estate. I would like to get hold of the catalogue or the plan, which are mentioned in this advert, to see if I can get to the bottom of this. But as I said, this is really another avenue of research, completely separate. So back to Charles William Alcock. He went to prep school in Woodford and then to the public school Harrow from 1855 to 59 with his brother John Forster Alcock. He wasn't academically gifted, but he was good at football. His father, who had been a ship owner and then a shipbroker, wanted him to work in the shipbroking business. So he liked football. In the 1850s, there were no common rules for football. All the public schools had their own version of the rules. Forest Football Club, this is the only picture I think that exists of them, was established in 1859 in his last year at Harrow, set up by him and his elder brother John Forster Alcock. It was set up so several old Harrovians could continue playing football, for which they had some ability after leaving school. The first captain was his brother John Forster Alcock. 4 of the team members were old Harrovians, but there was also a strong connection with Forest School, Snaresbrook. This is a picture of Forest School that I took last year. The first ground was at Snaresbrook, which had been described as a popular rendezvous for football clubs of the better class. The ground is thought to be close to what is now Snaresbrook Crown Court. In 1861, they created their own set of rules, largely based on Harrow School's rules. One of the rules was that if anyone didn't obey the rules, they would be fined 2 shillings and 6pence. Their competitive debut was against Crystal Palace in 1862. That Crystal Palace club being formed the year before in 1861. Crystal Palace, as we know it today, was founded in 1905, although as the 150th anniversary of the original Crystal Palace being formed is approaching, the modern Crystal Palace Club are now claiming they are connected. There was only a very limited number of football clubs at that time. Forest won 1-0. At the return match 3 weeks later, Forest won 4-0. On the 26th of October 1863, the Football Association was formed at the Freemasons Tavern, Great Queen Street, Covent Garden. As the leading club of the day, 2 members of Forest Club were in attendance, one of them being his brother John Forster, alongside representatives from 10 other clubs. The rules created by Cambridge University in 1848 were officially adopted by the Football Association. This is a case in point not to read history information on pubs' websites. The website for the Freemasons Arms in Longacre relates the fact that the first meeting of the FA took place in that pub. This is not true. The meeting actually took place at the Freemasons Tavern, which was in Great Queen Street. You can see how far apart these two pubs are. So the star at the bottom is the current Freemasons Arms, and the star at the top is next to the Connaught Rooms in Great Queen Street, and that is where the plaque is. It's showing the site of the Freemasons Tavern. This pub was demolished in the early 1900s. So really, do not believe what you read on pubs' websites. In 1863, oh, I've gone too far. Well, anyway, in 1863, Bell's Life sporting paper noted that the play of Mr. C. Alcock of the Forest Club elicited great applause. He stood just under 6 feet and weighed 13 stones 6 pounds, and he was an excellent dribbler and goal getter, very hard to knock off the ball and as hard a worker as he was enthusiastic. And sometime between February and April 1864, Forest Club became Wanderers, named as they were to have no fixed base for their future matches. Their strip was orange, violet and black. They finally found a home ground in the Kennington Oval. In 1870, the Sporting Gazette proclaimed them the MCC of football, which you can see circled on this newspaper report. Strangely, although Forest became Wanderers, Forest did continue to play, and on one occasion they played each other. C.W. Alcock was elected to the committee of the recently formed FA in 1866 at the age of 23 and became its secretary in 1870, a position he held for 25 years, the first 17 of which were unpaid. After scarcely a year in office as secretary, he proposed that it is desirable that a Challenge Cup should be established in connection with the association, for which all clubs belonging to the association should be invited to compete. This idea was based on knockout competitions at Harrow. This Challenge Cup, of course, is known today as the FA Cup, the proper name for the Football Association Challenge Cup. Now, the only picture there is of, as far as I know, the only picture there is of the Wanderers is the picture of the Forest Club, who became the Wanderers. But I have found a picture of the losing team, the Royal Engineers. So Wanderers and 14 other clubs entered. Wanderers were the first winners in 1872. In total, they won 5 times. The first final was played at the Oval. So Alcock wasn't just involved with football. That same year, 1872, C.W. Alcock was coincidentally elected Secretary of Surrey County Cricket, the tenants of the Oval, a post he held for the rest of his life. In 1899, cricket legend W.G. Grace said of him, "He is a cricket encyclopedia, full of reliable information and always ready to serve cricket by any means in his power." Wisden 1908 records that he was a steady bat, a fair change fast bowler and an excellent long stop, and that he once had the curious experience of captaining France against Germany at a match in Hamburg. He had many other sporting achievements, far more than I'm not going to list them all. If you want to know all his achievements, more details about his life can be found on the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, amongst many other places. But just a couple random ones. Chairman of the Richmond Athletic Association and Vice President of the Royal Mid-Surrey Golf Club. He also, apart from all these, president of this and chairman of that, and playing football and playing cricket, he also wrote a lot of books, so many books, publisher of cricket and football magazines, editor of annuals, just one of these people that just kept busy, basically. So what about his family life? Well, in December 1864, he married Eliza Caroline Ovenden, daughter of Francis Webb Ovenden, watercolourist and marine painter, in Islington. I couldn't actually find out where exactly in Islington, but I just know it's Islington. They had 2 sons and 6 daughters. So by the 1871 census, he'd already moved away from Chingford, living in Norwood. 1881 Brixton, 1891 and 1901 in Richmond in Surrey, and he died in 1907 when he was living in Brighton. His grave is at West Norwood Cemetery. His grave is there because he'd already bought a plot for a 5-month-old son who died in 1874 when they were living in Norwood. So that's why he's there. It's quite a plain grave. In 1992, the Football Association agreed to adopt the grave of the man who, in the words of their official historian, was the forgotten father of English sport. But what about the rest of his family? His father, Charles, became a respected JP in the local area. This slide shows one of many cases that I've found in the British newspaper archives. This petty session is like a local court, magistrates court, and this quite a minor offence of somebody not paying their fare on the train. But the next excerpt shows a murder. This murder, on the previous slide, you might have noticed, it's on this one, that one of the other magistrates was Sir Thomas, I can't pronounce it, Farrell Buxton. So if you know Chingford, you know Buxton features a lot in our history. So this is the details of a murder that took place at Chingford Hatch. So it was heard initially locally, and then later on it went to trial at the Old Bailey. So the Old Bailey online website, if you don't mind gory details, you can read the whole report of that trial on there. So oh, by the way, he was sentenced, Gaydon was sentenced to death, but if you've got our book on Chingford Hatch by Morna Daniels, you'll find out although he was sentenced to death, a reprieve was granted. So Charles William Alcock's parents are both buried at Chingford Old Church with 2 of their young children. And this slide shows an excerpt, the records of the Waltham Forest Family History Society have all the records on there. Not quite lastly, but I did find out that his sister, Ada Mary Eugenie Alcock, got married at St Peter St Paul, Chingford, on the 12th of October 1882. She married retired General Henry Blois, B-L-O-I-S, apologies for my pronunciation, Turner. She was 26, he was 74. A full report of the wedding, telling you what everybody wore, etc. And unlike today, I'm sure it would be very much different today, there is absolutely no mention made of the age difference. He was much older than her, so I can't remember when he died, but by 1901, she's living on her own means in Mayfair with a butler, housemaid and cook, and died in 1927 in Porchester Square and left £23,000. So I have used quite a few sources for my research, most of them online. Chingford Farms I would recommend. It's got a lot of useful information, and lastly Chingford Historical Society details and my own details. If anyone has any questions, please type them in the chat box, which I'll see when I stop sharing. Thank you. Claire's saying also Sunnyside Street in Leighton off Capworth Street are named after Sunnyside Farm and House. I mean, I have found when I've looked up Sunnyside, mostly on British Newspaper Archives, there are so many places called Sunnyside. It's all over the place. Wood locally, but much further afield as well. So, but I'm still trying to find out the details. Right, and second question, what about the building next to the King's Head? Actually, the guy who contacted me 5 years ago he thought their house might have been on the site of those houses next to the King's Head. I still need to do more research. It's so easy to go off on a tangent, but I'll probably write it all up and I'll post it, share it on with Chingford Historical Society.
Yeah, Joanna, thank you very much indeed for a very interesting talk. Even I learned something there. That's fantastic. Both my sons are big football fans. They probably didn't know that themselves. So that's great. So the next talk coming up, everyone, is a talk from David Boote. David is doing a talk on Chingford Hall. Chingford Hall, as you know, sat to the very south of what is known now as Chingford. The hall itself is long gone, but he's got some history to tell you about that. And also the Chingford Mill. So that is coming up very shortly. Just a reminder to you all out there in TV land that we've got another talk coming up on the 16th of July. That's going to be on a historic building in Chingford. That's to be confirmed. Please do visit our website at chingfordhistory.org.uk, where you can browse some of the information about us. Also join us if you want to as new members. Also we have social media via Twitter, Chingford Hist, and also Facebook, Chingford Historical Society. So if you want to keep an eye on what's going on with us with regards to future talks, and when eventually after we get through this lockdown we meet up as a society, then please keep in touch with us through those channels. Just a polite reminder that with the next talk, if you can keep your microphones on mute, that would be fantastic. And any questions you've got after seeing this talk and the next talk that's coming up, please use the chat. And if you don't want to use the chat and perhaps have a question after tonight's talks, please go to our website and send us a message. I'd also like to just say that if anybody out there has got any historical material that you'd like to share with us as a society and want to perhaps bring to our attention, please get in touch with us. We're always getting people contacting us with old books, with old family heirlooms, with old photographs of Chingford, and we can show these this historical information and share it with the society and also the wider public that are interested in local history. So I'm just going to ask Joanna, is she ready? You're on mute at the moment.
I'm ready.
Fantastic. Over to you.
Okay, I'll share the screen, and hopefully David's there somewhere.
I am, thank you. Shall I start talking?
Oh, it's there now.
Very good, thank you, Joanna. I had wanted to lead a walk before the virus came. I wanted to lead a walk for the Historical Society. And I'm rather fascinated by a corner of Chingford, which probably not a lot of people wander around. It's where Hall Lane meets the North Circular Road. There's a line of big sheds, which like to call themselves superstores, like Halfords. There's a car sales showroom and industrial units. And if you lift your eyes a bit up, you see the chimney of the Edmonton waste incinerator. So the smell of history is going to be in the air, or the smell of something anyway. But in the past, this was the medieval heart of Chingford. Do you want to move on to the next slide, Joanna? Yes. So some people will know this very well, but I'll say this because a few others may not. Chingford was divided between two manors. One, Chingford Earls, in earlier days called Chingford Gurnons, and the other one, Chingford St Paul's. They had manor houses close to each other, and they were down this southwestern corner of Chingford, down towards the Lee, but a bit above the floodplain. So everybody living in both manors had a long walk up the hill to the church on the top of Chingford Mount. But the manor houses were down on the lower ground, and I think it was probably because that's where the lord of the manor could control the fishing, catching of eels, wildfowl, and take a crop of hay off the grass on the ground that flooded in the winter. We don't know where the manor house for Chingford Earls was exactly. The other manor was given by King Edward the Confessor to the canons of St Paul's Cathedral. So the manor of Chingford St Paul's was helping pay for the clergyman who looked after the main church in the City of London, St Paul's Cathedral. And the canons got from the manor of Chingford St Paul's what would have been owed to a lord of the manor if it had been one person. In 1265, the manor of Chingford St Paul's had a house with a hall. So the whole house is the same, really. And there was a group of buildings inside a gated precinct with a chapel, a room for clergy, these two things being important for being the bosses being the clergymen of St Paul's Cathedral. It had a kitchen, a granary, a dairy, and outside the innermost gated area, there were more granaries, a kiln for drying grain, a stable, servants' quarters, and there were two enclosures around these, probably walls, fences, hedges and ditches. And outside all those enclosures, all three enclosures, was a pigsty, which I can understand why they wanted to keep themselves well away from the pigsty. Although the canons of St Paul's were not monks, and therefore they survived the dissolution of the monasteries, Henry VIII still managed to get hold of their land. So it goes through the hands of Henry VIII and his daughter Mary, but then soon, by 1567, the Lee family owned both the manors of St Paul's and Earls, and they were living in Chingford Hall until 1709. I said they were living there. It was one of their places they could live in. They didn't necessarily exclusively live in Chingford Hall. So if Joanna, you could move on to the next slide. So that's a Google satellite view of the site. And you might see, we can obviously see the North Circular. Hall Lane is coming down from top right, down towards bottom right. And there's a curly lane at the top of the screen, going from right to left. So just remember that curly lane. Can you move us on a bit, Joanna? Thank you. So My little talk, is based on two publications by Chingford Historical Society. And one is they're both by Septimus Barry, tremendous name, Septimus Barry. And he did a book on Chingford Hall, and this is the engraving that appears on the cover. Gary, for his opening slide for these talks, used the cover of that publication as an illustration of the talks. So it's an old engraving, and people who look at it think that it shows a medieval house which has been clad with Georgian type windows and doors, and it's got a couple of pretty old looking extensions to it. So this is the old Chingford Hall, and this is where the lords of the manor of Chingford were living, the Lee family when they were there. This is also reproduced, this illustration, in a book by Barbara Ray called Chingford Past. And her book, which is another very good book on the history of Chingford, is particularly good for its quality of its illustrations and printing. So I recommend that as well. Can we move on again, Joanna? Right, so this is an old map, 1777, by Chapman and Andre, who were good map makers. And you can see in this map a crossroads towards the top right, which is where the shops of Chingford Mount now are. And the road going left, going west from the crossroads, is one arm of Hall Lane. And then in 1777, it just did a sharp right angle bend to the left and went down past Chingford Hall and its cluster of buildings around the hall. I said they're good map makers, but Chapman and Andre have labelled Chingford Hall Mrs. Mary Snell, who was the member of the Snell family who was responsible for it in 1777. And he also labels it Chingford Green. That's not what we think of as Chingford Green at all. I have no idea why Chapman and Andre used that description, Chingford Green. You can see just to the left, just to the west of that, there's a label for Bleak Hall, which is on the western side of the River Lee in Edmonton. And that was an old building, which was a bit of a landmark in previous centuries. So you look at a cluster of buildings with Mrs. Mary Snell's name against it. The first line to the left, to the west, sorry, is the mill stream for Chingford Mill. The mill itself is labelled a fulling mill, fulling being a system of processing cloth. Clay was hammered into the cloth to improve its cloth-likeness. And just to the left, to the west of the mill stream, is the River Lee, which is the boundary between Chingford and Edmonton, and between between Essex and Middlesex. Right, and there is a line, of a straight line, just to the west of the old River Lee, and that's the River Lee navigation, which was dug out for boats to sail much more easily along the artificial channel than they could have done along the original River Lee. And that was very recent in 1777. The various bits of work that need to be done to keep a canal type navigation operating were only completed just before 1777. So by the beginning of the 19th century, the Snell family weren't living in Chingford Hall at all, but they were letting it out and just taking the money from rent. And by that time, the Snell family were lords of the manor of Chingford Earls and Chingford St Paul's, I believe. If you can move us on, Joanna, please. So this is a copy of the tithe map of Chingford, drawn up in 1838 as a part of the process for separating land from a tax in favour of the church called the tithe, originating in the medieval practice of the priest getting the 10th chicken or the 10th bundle of grain. Well, that was being phased out in the 19th century, and tithe maps were drawn up to help that process. And they're a wonderful picture of the agricultural land in 1838. Each field has been numbered, and a schedule, an apportionment schedule, shows whether that was arable land or pastoral land, who owned it and who was occupying it, who was farming it usually. And this again shows that cluster of buildings around Chingford Hall, with all their outbuildings. And it shows just to the left there, to the west, another cluster of buildings, and that's the Chingford Mill. And then that was pieces of water, which I was explaining to you before. Now, around 1840, so it's very soon after the tithe map, the old manor house of Chingford St Paul's was sadly demolished and rebuilt. And this is the same time that Friday Hill House in North Chingford was demolished and rebuilt by another lord of the manor, Robert Boothby Heathcote. So I'm not quite sure what the craze was for knocking down old manor houses and rebuilding them, but it happened in both manors, in two places anyway, in Chingford around 1840. The new manor house for Chingford St Paul's was in yellow brick and a fairly ordinary house. There had been a moat around the manor house, and this was cut back in scale and really made part of the garden landscaping for the house. Can we move on, Joanna? So this is a photo of the rebuilt manor house, showing a very pleasant, regular design. Quite a desirable house nowadays if it had survived. Can you move us on again, Joanna? And this wonderfully picturesque photograph, I imagine it was taken in the early 1900s, shows towards the back what I believe was Chingford Hall. Actually, I say it's, yeah, that's a bit odd. I must say that looks very old, doesn't it? That house at the back with wooden clad on this gable and extensions. So perhaps the photo's older than I anticipate. It comes from Barbara Ray's book on Chingford Past, but I couldn't see any reference in her book as to where she found the photo. She does credit Chingford Historical Society for providing illustrations, and perhaps that's it. So here you can see a section of the moat surviving with a boat that looks a bit of a messing about him kind of boat, which adds to the picturesque image, all those reeds at the back. Not in the photo is a kitchen garden which had 14-inch thick Tudor walls, and they survived well into the 20th century. And there was also a brew house. Chingford Hall had its own brew house, again, very late on, so it could brew its own beer. In the 1851 census, the resident of Chingford Hall was a farmer, Mr. J.T. Humphreys. He was still there in 1874. And in the farmhouse, there were farm workers living. So it was a bit of a accommodation base for the farm workers. Can we move us on again? Thank you, Joanna. So here's a massive barn. And again, the photos from Barbara Ray's Chingford Past. I don't know the real date of the photo, but you can see it's a real classic style of barn, a big cart will be driven in after harvesting through those big gates. And there'll be other big gates on the other side of the barn. They would provide a through draft. The grain would be threshed so that all the dust and light chaff would fly off, and the grain would be collected for grinding to corn. Before the end of the 19th century, Chingford Hall, its farm, and the hall were purchased by the East London Waterworks Company, which started off down the River Lee towards Hackney. And as London expanded, its population hugely expanded, the Waterworks Company had to massively expand its facilities for processing water to make it drinkable. So that's what the water company is doing. And before the end of the 20th century, I think it's before the end of the 20th century, the Waterworks Company is privatised and becomes the Metropolitan Water Board. Can you move us on, Joanna? So this is, it's a redrawing of a map. At one time, it was very difficult to get permission to copy maps because of perceived problems with copyright. So here somebody has spent a lot of time redrawing a map, which they found in an archive, originally collected by the East London Waterworks. And it says in the possession of British Waterways. I think now I would go to the London Metropolitan Archives to look for it, which is where you find the archives of Thames Water. But here you can see Chingford Hall surrounded by a rectangular moat, a cluster of farm buildings now to the north of the farm moat, of the Hall moat, sorry. And you can see that curly lane, which I was pointing out to in the Google satellite photo. So the curly lane survives. It's now the lower Hall lane. And it's a very quiet stretch of roadway now. And that's leading down bottom left of the map, southwest, to another cluster of properties called the Mill on this map, with the roadway crossing the Mill stream and a toll bridge. So anybody who wanted to cross the Mill stream had to pay a toll to the lord of the manor. Hall Farm was being run by Mr. F.A. Tolworthy, an interesting name, Tolworthy, from 1887. And by 1923, Mr. Tolworthy had bought the hall, so it was his property. Now my story now leads you to where modernity really hits Chingford, because the North Circular Road is built just below this sketch map here, and that attracts, as it has always done, business because of its tremendously improved transport links. And two men called A. Coote and C. Coote, they'd set up somewhere in Chingford a business making products from cork, and they transferred this to Chingford Hall, where there was a lot of land which they could develop, and they were right by the North Circular Road to get their cork products away and to get their raw cork brought in for processing. So 1928 North Circular Road is built. Like I mentioned, it gets very quickly, this part of Chingford gets a shirt factory, Redford and Gilbert, and an engineering factory, Peter Hooker, who I think is later in Walthamstow. And the London Rubber Industries takes over some of these business premises after the Second World War. The Cork Manufacturing Company was in possession of Chingford Hall and Farm in 1940. Sadly, the Cork Manufacturing Company demolished the farmhouse, the one of 1840, and the associated buildings, some which were much older, of course, the Tudor market garden walls. The Chingford Hall was for a period offices, the moat was filled in, and the gardens were built over. Can we move on, Joanna? So here is an aerial photograph of the cork factory. By then, the cork manufacturing company have completely filled the site with must have been got a big investment in modern buildings and completely filled the site. Towards the top right, you can see the curve of Lower Hall Lane with some trees lining it, and you can see the bridge crossing the mill stream to what is the mill. And Modern Hall Lane is bottom right on the photograph, and the North Circular is bottom left. Can we move on, Joanna? The Parsmore Edwards Museum, based in Newham, did do an archaeological dig when the cork company was redeveloping the area, and they found some trenches. Sorry, they found 2 fireplaces, but the cork manufacturing company closed, and that's when the whole site became a retail area. The cork manufacturing company closed in 1983, and that's really where we lose our history. So this photograph is another very old photograph. Again, I just don't know, I'm afraid, what the date of it is, but you can see a huge water wheel. And this is because I'm going to move on to the operations of the water company, which was around the mill rather than around the hall. And you can see a stretch of waterway and a mill building in this photograph. Chingford had a mill when Domesday Book was prepared in 1086. And I imagine it was on the site or very close to it. At the time of Domesday Book, the mill was in Gurnan's Manor, not St Paul's, but Gurnan's Manor, later St Paul's, later Chingford Earls. If you remember the earlier map of Chapman and Andre of 1777, the mill by that time, 1777, was fulling cloth. By 1848, the mill was back to grinding wheat, and it carried on grinding wheat, the mill, until the mill closed in 1880. By then, water-powered technology was a very old hat. In 1851, at the census, the man who was living in Chingford Mill was Mr. W. Swain, and he was a journeyman miller, so he was learning how to mill. Right, so this photo we're looking at is also from Barbara Ray's book. Oh, sorry, she does give a date. No, she says the date of the photo she thinks might be about 1906, but it's not survived well. I can see a question which I'll answer even though I shouldn't do, which is when fulling is a process adopted to woolen cloth. So it's part of what was the big industry of early modern England was wool, sheep, rearing sheep, and weaving wool in Norfolk and other places. In 1882, the mill was leased to Richard Hunt by the trustees of the River Lee. And the lane, Lower Hall Lane, was leading to Bleak Hall Bridge over the River Lee. And Bleak Hall Bridge later became Cook's Ferry, once a ferry, and later a large concrete bridge carrying the North Circular Road. Can you move us on, Joanna? So that's a reminder of the Chapman and Andre map with Bleak Hall, middle left, and that's where there would have been a ferry across to Bleak Hall in 1777 with another toll across it. So if you were taking something like wheat to be milled, you got stung possibly by 2 sets of tolls. You might like to note whilst we're looking at this map that Hall Lane, with its right angle bend, is heading south. It crosses the River Ching, close to where the River Ching joins the River Lee. And then there's another sharp bend, and that's Folly Lane, which also survives even to this day. It now passes a traveller's site and a Muslim burial ground, and then goes over the border into Walthamstow and Higham Hill. But if we were to be able to lead a walk, it's another interesting, if rather spooky, area to wander along. In 1877, Richard Hunt got compensation for the tolls which he was no longer to be allowed to levy, because the Victorians were beginning to find tolls over bridges, particularly bridges over the River Thames, very inconvenient and a restraint on trade. So there was a big scheme for doing away with the tolls and paying compensation for those people who've been taking them. Richard Hunt had been taking them for the one on Lower Hall Lane, and he got compensation for what was reckoned to be £200 he was getting each year for tolls, which is quite a lot of money in those days, £200 a year. In 1886, the East London Waterworks Company demolished the mill and the miller's house, sadly, and he dug a well and a deeper borehole to get more water than was being carried on down from the River Lee and the mill stream. An engine was transferred to these works, the well and the borehole, and then another engine was installed. This is 1890, 1891, and then a turbine house was built. So can you move us on, Joanna? Right, we're back to this house, this map. I think you can move us on again, I think, Joanna. We've seen that map. So this is the turbine house, which just about survives at the moment. It's been turned into a residence with, I think, double glazing and various other modernizations. But this is how the turbine house used to look when it was housing engines that were extracting water to go into the water treatment system. And you can see I think you can see just in front of it, the surrounds of what looks like a well. Can you move us on, Joanna? So this is a very different kind of building, which I would now call the Chingford Mill survives until today. So this is the waterworks, it had some kind of engine inside it. You'd think from the height of the building it would have been a wonderful beam engine, but there's no indication there ever was such a beam engine or similar engine. And Septimus Barry looked into it and decided he just couldn't work out what kind of engine it was providing the power to pump the water out of the Lee and into the water treatment system. You can see the chimney for the steam engine, which is there. And this building is in the red brick. And once had, as well as a pump, it had boilers, 3 steam engines. And can you move us on, Joanna? Here's another shot. The building's on the left from the previous slide, but here you can see a house for the manager of the works, I would imagine. And in front of it, there's a circle of bricks. And that is thought to be the capped off well, which was once used by the Waterworks Company to take water as well as from the turbine house over the stream. The steam engine got its coal from the railway station at Angel Road. Angel Road station closed last year and has now been replaced south of the North Circular by Meridian Station. It's part of a big redevelopment, but when the waterworks machinery is fully operating, coal would have been brought by horse-drawn vehicles from Angel Road Station Goods Yard along a Lower Hall Lane to this site here. Around 1903, as part of the extension of the waterworks up the Lee Valley, an aqueduct was constructed, dug, through the Lee Marshes from a bit south of Waltham Abbey down to close to these pumping works and down closer towards the Banbury and Lockwood reservoirs in Walthamstow. So that the aqueduct was 3.5 miles long, so it was a major undertaking, and it really was part of the transformation section of the River Lee into something it just can't be recognised from its previous history. The engines in the turbine house were abandoned around 1905. The aqueduct had reduced the water flow, and it's no longer worth trying to extract water from the Lee or the Mill stream. Can you move us on, Joanna? So here is an aerial photograph, and I have to admit I'm struggling to recognise exactly what I'm looking at. I can see the Chingford Mill site as waterworks. So the curly Lower Hall Lane is coming off the straight Hall Lane at the right side of the photograph. It passes the Chingford Mill buildings, that pumping engine house, crosses over the mill stream, and then crosses over what I think is the new aqueduct, and then carries on. So that would take you towards Edmonton, and still does. But I think I can see another larger curvish channel, and that I think must be the course of the historic River Lee before the straight River Lee navigation was constructed on the left-hand side of the photo. And at the top of the photo, I would have thought that shape was the William Girling Reservoir made in between the World Wars. But I'm struggling a bit to work out exactly what the photograph is of. Clearly it's an aerial photograph. The photograph comes from the Photographic Archives of Thames Water, which you can actually access online. Quite a big archive of historic photos that Thames Water have digitised. The most northernmost reservoir in this section of the Lee Valley is the King George V, and that opened in 1913, before the William Girling Reservoir. And most of the William Girling Reservoir is, most of the George V Reservoir is north of Chingford, Sewardson and Enfield. And it's said that spoil from the construction of the William Girling Reservoir, that's the more latest one, the interwar one, was spread between the River Lee diversion and the River Lee navigation. So that would be across this photograph. But if I can see the course of the River Lee, that transfer of soil doesn't seem to have taken place. In 1948, the system for powering the pumps was made electrical, and a modern building was put up, and the chimney, smoke chimney for Chingford Mill was taken down. So can you move us on, Joanna, to the next slide? So this is a photo of Chingford Mill with the chimney having been taken down, and I think various works have been done to it. And that photograph was taken in 1954. Can you move us on, Joanna? So this is a sketch map in Septimus Barry's book about Chingford Mill. And here he shows the location of various parts of the water treatment works in the southwestern corner of Chingford. And the topmost label is Lower Hall Lane Pumping Station, South Essex Supplementary Supply. And that was the modern building post-war, which had electric pumps in it. Right, can you move us on, Joanna? So this is a photograph of Chingford Mill and the turbine house. I'm not sure the exact date of the photograph. Can you move us on again, Joanna? So this is the post-war building with electric pumps inside it. They'd be mainly automatic, so they wouldn't need 24-hour staffing. From 1975, the water from this area was being piped after chemical treatment to a reservoir at Chigwell. I don't know why, but that's what was. So I think the reference in Septimus Barry's sketch map to the South Essex supply is part of the reference to that transfer of water east into Essex, perhaps to do with the greater population of Essex. So can we move on again, Joanna? So Chingford Mill is now nothing to do with Thames Water. It's been sold off. I don't know who the present owners are. They've been doing some sort of building works. There is a certain development of new housing to the left of this photo, south of the mill. Some other nasty barbed wire and things, changes being made. But this photograph I took this month. So it's an up-to-date photograph of Chingford Mill as it now is. Can you move us on, Joanna? That's a photograph I took from near the North Circular Road. So it's from the other side of the mill, from the last photograph. And it shows an aqueduct. The setting is now fairly green. So quite a lot of mature trees around. And I think if it wasn't for the rubbish strewn around the place, Chingford Mill could look quite picturesque. Move us on, Joanna. So somebody queried whether the turbine house could have been converted into a house. I think I've only got one photograph here of the turbine house as a domestic residence. I want to show this one because it shows the machinery for operating a sluice gate, controlling the flow of water underneath the turbine house, which would have been important when water was being extracted using the turbines. And you can see the half timbering 1930s type design of the turbine house has continued. Actually, it's probably not 1930s, it's more recent now. Move us on, Joanna. Right. So I'm coming to the end of my talk. So the water works is no longer operating as it ever did. Chingford Hall has disappeared. The cork factory has disappeared, but it's remembered in the survival of a cork tree, the kind of tree that grows in Spain or Italy, which used to be used to cork wine bottles, make wine bottles, stoppers from. Wonderful, interesting texture to the bark of the cork tree, and you can see there's an interpretation board by the tree. So these things you can still see, though I warn you that the North Circular Road is just a stone's throw from the left of this photograph. Move on again, Joanna. So this is a reminder of the sources that I've been using. The two booklets published by Chingford Historical Society and written by Septimus Barry. The original publications being in the 1970s. Chingford Hall having been reprinted through our late and wonderful president, David Young. He organised that in 2010. And the last I mention, but the most splendid in terms of print reproduction, is Chingford Past by Barbara Ray. That was published in 2003 by Historic Publications Limited. So that's the end of my talk. I'm very willing to answer questions. But I'm going to pass over to Gary, who's going to give some rounding out conclusions, I think.
Okay, so fascinating talk there by David, and also Joanna's talk before that. While I'm just talking, David, there are some questions that have come up on the chat. Can you see them there? Have a quick look, because I think there are, someone said there's a cork tree at the end of Hall Lane before you reach the North Circular. Fantastic. That is certainly been spotted by David. Do we know what kind of cloth was milled? Wool perhaps, or silk? Another question there by Claire. Can you answer that one, David? David? I think David...
No, my trouble is I'm using a small Android tablet.
Oh, I see. Okay.
It's got a microphone and a camera.
If I find the questions, maybe you can answer. So someone asked, Claire asked, what kind of cloth was being milled? Do we know? Was it wool or...
I did briefly answer that question during my talk.
Okay.
So I was saying that the cloth was woolen cloth,
Yeah.
because fulling was one of the main processes that cloth was taken after it had been first woven. You get hammered with clay, which improves the cloth. I think cloth had to be treated in that way before it became a wearable cloth or a blanket cloth.
Yes.
It's a very common process in the early modern period and later.
Okay, and we must be clear. I think a message came in from Slattery asking whether the big house had been renovated, as it looks a bit too big. I think am I right in saying that the pump house or the buildings replaced the old hall, and that the old hall none of the buildings in the old hall actually survive today? That's right, isn't it?
Yes, the old hall got completely demolished, very sadly, but
Yeah.
it had been rebuilt in 1840. So it's a
Right.
bit like Friday Hill House, which has also been turned into a residence. But Friday Hill House is the 1840 building. Chingford Hall, the 1841 even, just got completely demolished. It was just an archaeological dig even in the 1980s.
Mm. And I certainly remember myself going, using Lower Hall Lane as a cut through from the North Circular to Hall Lane, but I think it was closed some probably 15 years ago now. And I think it's only used for works traffic, which is a shame, really. Okay.
So what did you say it was used for, Gary?
You could use Lower Hall Lane, that lane from the North Circular to Hall Lane.
That is correct. I live opposite. I live on Waverley Avenue, opposite
yes.
the Hall Lane, and
Yes.
we used to use that as a cut through to get home for a long time. Yeah.
Thank you, Slattery. That's correct.
You're talking about vehicles. Talking about vehicles, I think.
Sorry, I do mean vehicles. Yeah, I do mean vehicles.
Yeah.
But I think there was some works undertaken there some 10, 15 years ago, and the lane was then closed for
Close to traffic. But
Yeah.
I do want to emphasise that you can still walk and cycle along.
Is that correct? Fantastic. Okay, that's
I did it this month, so I can tell you with up-to-date information.
right. Fantastic. Well, certainly some history there that I didn't know about. I'm hoping those people out there also learned something today. So I'm just going to get my screen to give me access to, bear with me, share my screen, bear with me please everybody. Here we go. So just a reminder that thank you very much everyone, first of all, for joining us today for those interesting talks. As you can see, we've put a lot of effort into researching here at Chingford Historical Society, and this is the second in the series of talks that we've got now online. Our next talk is coming up next month on the 16th of July. We're going to do another historic building in Chingford, because I believe that you guys out there are interested in historical places and people of Chingford. So we're going to be doing that next month, 16th of July. Please do stay in touch with us. If you have any questions after what you've seen tonight, go to our website, send us a message. We'll answer any questions that you've got there. In addition to that, please have a look. If you want to become a member, go to the website again. You can become a member of Chingford Historical. We're holding fees now back until next year because we're not actually meeting, so you'll have free membership until next year. How good is that? Also, check us out on Twitter. We have a Twitter feed which we update as well regarding any future talks and bit of history that might be going on in Chingford. And also Facebook, Chingford Historical Society. We have our own Facebook page there as well. Don't worry if you missed some of today's talks, because tomorrow night at the latest, we'll be uploading this talk as a video to our YouTube channel, and that's Chingford Historical Society. So if you've got family and friends that also perhaps have missed it today, they can watch it again tomorrow. Obviously, we've got our last talk that was on there from last month. Thank you, everybody, for listening and watching today. It's been fantastic, the 2 talks that we've had, and we very much look forward to seeing you all again next month. Thank you.